So I have the honor of introducing the first keynote for today, which is Professor Mark Andrejevic. Now, as most of you are hopefully aware, Mark has had to cancel his trip to Washington last minute as he had to stay in Australia for an important grant meeting that was scheduled very late. This makes no difference whatsoever, by the way. Okay. So I'll just project. I think it's okay.
It was working for me. So
What is it?
It's just working.
Is this working? Okay. All right. It didn't. All right. Okay. So yeah, he had to stay in Australia for an important grant meeting that was scheduled very late and couldn't be moved. So he was kind enough instead to record his talk. So we're really in for a treat and really appreciate his efforts at doing that. So that's what we'll be playing. Now, Mark is a professor of communication and media studies at Monash University, where he contributes expertise in the social and cultural implications of data mining and online monitoring. He's the author of more than 60 journal articles and book chapters and 3 books, including Infoglut, which was one of the first to comprehensively engage with developments in data mining from a social-cultural perspective. His work has been hugely influential in this field, and I've also had the privilege personally to recently collaborate with him on some of the themes that we'll hear about today, which has been very inspiring, so I'm really happy that we can include his contribution via this video. So we'll play this, and then after the video, we'll just pause for a moment for some thoughts, and then we'll move into the first panel. Okay, so that's how it works. So.
Good morning, and thank you in advance for what I hope was a very kind introduction. I want to apologize for not being able to be there in person, and I want to thank Nick and Karin and Andreas and Lina for organizing this and for including me, and for also willing to include me even when I was unable to make it. I really wanted to be there. The group of scholars who you've assembled are scholars with whom I want to catch up, some of whom I haven't met but wanted to meet. And so I'm very sorry not to be there, but the Australia Research Council, I've learned, waits for no person. So I hope to be able to catch up with you sometime in the future. And I hope that these remarks might provide something in the way of a useful connection to what's coming and some provocations to think about. I'm going to start off by talking about automated surveillance. And I apologize, it's quite tricky talking to this empty room, so I'm going to hopefully try to mobilize, I don't know, some sense of audience interactivity or response or energy. I'll do what I can. I'm talking about automated surveillance because it seemed to me to be an interesting way to approach the theme of automated justice and sociality and society. And I'm going to try to bring together, through automated surveillance, both of those things, a form of automated justice that I'm going to talk about when I talk about preemption, and the way I think that it relates to broader social transformations associated with automation, in particular automated media. I'm going to start with the tragic example of the ongoing failure in the US to generate a meaningful political response to the tragedy of mass shootings. What we've seen in the context of the ongoing news coverage is a concession of the inability of political response and the forwarding of a different type of response, which I'm describing as preemption. If you look at the coverage of the UNC Charlotte shootings in the New York Times, and this is characteristic of a lot of the coverage, on the one hand there's the admission of political failure, and the other hand, the invocation of the response that takes place in a post-political context, the individualization of protection and preemption. So the notion that individuals are now being tasked to take into their own hands the preemptive forms of intervention meant to minimize the tragedy of the outcomes of the attacks. And there are actually systems that are training civilian responders to address these attacks in their moment of emergence. The ALICE system, for example, received a fair amount of coverage in the wake of recent shootings. ALICE stands for Alert, Lockdown, Inform, Counter, and Evacuate. Counter in this case means attack the attacker. And as we've seen in recent coverage, this is becoming one modality of response that's being adopted with tragic results, and also a certain amount of effectiveness that's coincides with that tragedy. As the trainer put it, waiting on law enforcement is not enough. In this sense, the standard state solution isn't going to work, so individuals have to take matters into their own hands, even if that means 12-year-olds who are now thinking about how they're going to respond in the case of an attack on their schools. And this has received also a lot of media coverage because of the tragic implications of the failure to respond politically falling upon the youngest and most protected but also most vulnerable members of society. To think about heroism as prevention, as I suggested earlier, is to invoke a particular notion of the temporality of preemption. And what I mean by this is preemption operates in the moment of emergence of the attack. How can the attack be addressed when it happens? And rather than turning to a policy response, what we've seen is the invocation of the importance of the victims themselves intervening to preempt. I think this logic of political failure being mirrored by the invocation of preemption has a broader social resonance. And I'm going to try to unpack that and say a little bit more what I mean by that. And I'm going to juxtapose these terms, prevention and preemption, to try to highlight those differences. Often these terms are used interchangeably, but I'm going to try to mark a difference between them and to explain what I mean by the difference. Prevention, I think of as implying a modality of a longer-term temporal frame that invokes logics of description, explanation, and causal analysis that result in policy prescriptions. There has to be an efficient logic of representation at work for such approaches to operate. In other words, there has to be a consensus on the description of the situation, on the explanation of causality, and on the potential results of political policy. When that breaks down, or those conditions don't seem to obtain, preemption suggests itself as a response. What I mean by preemption is the standard example of, for example, predictive policing. The machine that deploys the patrol in the nick of time to stop a criminal act as it starts to take place. There was a story in some of the early coverage of PredPol, the predictive policing program that was developed in California, of a police patrol in Santa Cruz that was sent to a parking structure right at a moment when there were some folks who were apparently attempting to burgle cars. That notion of emergence. We sent them there right as the crime was happening, and they stopped it in the nick of time. Preemptive logics dispense with narratives of explanation and causality. Not entirely, but that's not the prime emphasis. They rely on a temporality of pure imminence. Something is going to happen. Catch it at the moment that it emerges. And they dispense with representational logics in favor of operational ones. Intervene at the moment of emergence of the risk. To give you an example of what I think of as the contrast between prevention and preemption, we might think of the block grant funding in the 1990s that in the US was earmarked for police departments to build community resources that were meant to reduce criminality, especially among juveniles. The goal was to think about what the underlying causes of criminality in a community might be and to address those through building and strengthening the community. What's happened since that period is those block grants have been canceled and the monies have been diverted to technological equipment, digital equipment, the type of equipment that's used in predictive policing systems and other forms of surveillance and detection. So a move from societal intervention to a form of technological response, but in particular technological response which dispenses with the logic of underlying causality and turns to the moment of emergence as a response. A kind of abdication of the notion that society might be understood and instead an acceptance of the notion that in some ways it's incomprehensible. Emergent acts happen. What we have to do is develop rapid response systems in order to be able to intervene at the moment of emergence. Now, one of the responses to the turn to the victims as possible agents of preemption, rather than attempting to say what we need is a policy response, rather than trying to train children and acclimatize them to this environment of threat and to make them think about how they'll respond, to develop an automated or technological solution. And I'm thinking here of companies like Zero Eyes, ex-military folks who are developing image classification systems that they claim can detect somebody carrying a weapon on their way to a school or other potential site of attack. And before that person arrives, identify the weapon, identify the authorities, automatically lock down the facility that's being threatened, and provide detailed information about the location and the armaments of the person who's posing the threat. Another company called Athena, funded in part by Peter Thiel, does something very similar. They use image classification and AI systems to identify potential threatening behavior, including carrying weapons, but also forms of behavior that deviate from the norm and that can be tagged as potentially a potential threat or potential risk. And one of the claims that Athena makes that I think speaks to the logics of temporality is that they're able to detect that a punch is being thrown once the punch is started, but before it lands. That short interval is the interval of the temporality of emergent response. That there's enough confidence to understand that a threat is there, but that the threat can be detected and responded to before it arrives. That's the temporality of emergence. And as you can tell from that temporality, it's going to require eventually an automated response, right? The next step for these systems, it seems logically, perhaps inevitably, is not just detection, but intervention. No one can afford to wait when seconds matter. If you look at the statistics between 3 to 5 minutes, the average length of shooter in school, 12 to 5 minutes, the average length of police response. If you've got to intervene before the police can respond, either that means people doing it or automated forms of response. So I think we can anticipate down the road, we're going to imagine systems that don't just detect threat, and maybe don't just lock down, but intervene in some ways to detain, to violently preempt potential threat. That sequence corresponds to what I think of as the broader logic of the cascade of automation. That once you have the ability to automatically collect large amounts of data, you need to be able to process them in automated ways, and that pushes in the direction of automated response. And we can see that in a variety of different realms of social practice that are associated with logics of data collection. Think of, for example, Amazon.com's system for shipping you packages before you know you want them. On the one hand, automated data collection, they have all kinds of information about you. They can use automated systems to process that, and the claim to be able to know what you want before you know what you want and to deliver it to you before you order it. That's a preemptive logic. At the moment of the emergence of desire, you open the door and you find the package that you want. That's the analog to, in the context of risk, stopping the punch before it lands. Why the shift to preemption? And I'll come up with a couple of approaches to this. But one of the claims that I want to make is that it takes place against the background of the decline of symbolic efficiency. And that leads to the question, well, why the decline of symbolic efficiency? I'll attempt to say more about that in a second. And again, this is a rather short presentation, so I can mostly gesture in some directions. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek uses the notion of the decline of symbolic efficiency to talk about the inefficacy of what might have been once construed to be shared narratives that operate effectively at the level of the social and the political. And the demise of symbolic efficiency is when those narratives lose their purchase or lose the guarantee that allows them to function effectively or efficiently within a social or political context. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to trace it through contemporary political examples, narratives of causality and also the operation of surveillance. I'm going to argue that the panopticon relies fundamentally on symbolic efficiency. So here's a kind of silly example, but I think it drives the point home. There's a treasure hunter who, back in when Obama was president, after the killing of Osama bin Laden, didn't believe the public statement about the fact that Osama bin Laden had been located and killed and buried at sea. He said he wouldn't believe it unless he saw the body himself, and because he's a treasure hunter, he embarked on a search to find that body. And he said, I'm doing it because I'm a patriot American who wants to know the truth. I do it for the world. This notion of patriotism has become quite familiar in the world of conspiracy theories, that unless you see it for yourself, all mediated or symbolic representations are subject to terminal forms of dysfunction. The phrase that Slavoj Žižek uses, borrowing from the Marx Brothers, is symbolic efficiency is that moment when you believe the other's words over your own eyes, as in the phrase, who do you believe, my words or your eyes? As we know from a realm of forms of the breakdown of symbolic efficiency, this logic spreads across contested realms of political struggle. So climate change, the lack of the efficiency of the scientific explanations for what's going on. If you think of the Barack Obama birth certificate conspiracy theory, it was quite clear that there was going to be no evidence that would satisfy those who did not believe Barack Obama was born in the United States, other than having seen it themselves. Right? And the resurgence of flat earthism privileges the evidence of my eyes over the symbolic efficiency of explanations. Global warming, if you look out the window and those politicians who say, hey, it's snowing, it's colder than ever today, so much for global warming. This is an ostensible turn to a particular type of positivism that dispenses with the need, with reliance on symbolic mediation, or at least imagines that it does. So that has grave implications for the functioning of policy responses, obviously. We see it in climate change, we see it in gun control and gun violence, we see it in a range of political contexts. In the practice of surveillance, I think we also see a breakdown of symbolic efficiency. The claim here is that the panopticon is fundamentally a symbolic modality of control and discipline, that the panopticon relies upon the spectacle of the tower as a symbolic representation of surveillance that leads the subject to internalize the monitoring gaze, and that therefore the panopticon relies on the knowledge that one is being watched. It relies on that symbolic knowledge. And we know that that symbolic power can actually be used in certain contexts as a form of control itself. You don't have a camera, you have a fake camera, you have a dummy camera, you have the spectacle of surveillance, not actual surveillance. And the argument that I want to make here is not that panopticism is being completely displaced, but that there's another logic that we need to attend to. And that's a post-symbolic logic, an operational logic of surveillance. The company Athena concedes what might be described as the demise of the symbolic efficiency of surveillance when it criticizes dumb camera systems for only being able to document crimes after they happen. But that's what the panopticon does, right? It can only document that a crime has happened after it's happened, or as it's happening, and record that it's happened and then respond. Only Athena's next generation camera can help stop crime in its tracks. We need not just the symbolic power of surveillance, but the operational power, a camera that can intervene, that can stop crime in its tracks. So this is pushing in the direction of what I mean by operational surveillance. One way of thinking about the operation of operational surveillance is through the lens of environmentality invoked by Foucault in his lectures on biopolitics, when he marks what might be described as a turn away from disciplinary logics, On the one hand, what he identifies is a massive withdrawal with regard to the normative disciplinary system. The technology to be employed is not discipline normalization, not the subjectification of individuals based on the symbolic recognition of the threat of surveillance, but action on the environment, modifying the terms of the game, not the player's mentality. This seems to me to be a suggestive way of thinking about what I'm describing as operational responses. The goal is to intervene at the level of what Foucault describes as the milieu. Change the milieu, change the rules of the games in order to influence, control the subjects that are in that milieu. I'm not even sure if subjects is the necessary term there, the individuals in that milieu. And I'm going to invoke the notion of framelessness to describe what I think is the necessary correlate of environmentality, which is environment-level information collection and environment-level modulation. So when I invoke the notion of framelessness, what I mean to think about is the ambition to collect all information about everything in order to be able to detect emergence at the moment of emergence, and to be able to intervene at that moment, to modulate the environment in ways that respond automatically, perhaps, to the moment of emergence. This is from an article by Ben Anderson about the use of drones in counterinsurgency. And one of the claims that he makes is the logic of counterinsurgency, or the way it's formulated in these contexts of imminent threat, is that when threat is dispersed across the population, and we could say something similar about, for example, the mass shootings in the US, and anybody could become an insurgent, then everything is dangerous. When everything is dangerous, all of life must be known and intervened in without limit or remainder. And this is what I mean by framelessness. The ambition to know all of life without limit or remainder, total surveillance. It's an impossible goal, but that doesn't mean that it's not one that drives contemporary logics of digitization. To say that it's impossible doesn't mean that people aren't trying to do it in certain ways. And the example that comes to mind immediately is Kevin Kelly's recent annual article in Wired magazine about augmented reality, which he describes as a mirror world, and whose ambition, he claims, is to be able to put an interactive overlay over the entire physical environment, but doing that requires constant monitoring of that environment in order to respond to what's taking place, in order to change what's taking place in that environment, in order to modulate it. Invoking Borges, he puts it this way: to recreate a map that is as big as the globe in 3D, no less, you need to photograph all places and things from every possible angle all the time, which means you need to have a planet full of cameras that are always on. But not just cameras. Why cameras? All sensors. You need to have sensors everywhere all the time, collecting everything at every position. That's the scope of the ambition. Impossible, yes, but from this account, the structural imperative of the development of this technology. Another way to think about what I'm describing as framelessness is the function creep isn't even the word, but the way in which function creep itself is built into the conception of what data collection means. There's an alternative credit scoring companies. There are a bunch of them that are sprouting up, and they use different sources of data to assess credit risk. They operate in this data mining register, looking for emergent correlations. And one of the claims that this company, one of the findings this company came up with is that among the thousands of factors that determine credit risk is whether you write your name in all capitals or whether you capitalize the first letter of your name and then the rest in lowercase. And apparently your credit risk is higher if you use all caps, if you're screaming on your application. What struck me was the quote of the person who was running this company, who'd founded this company: all data is credit data. And I think this is the broader claim that one could make about how data functions in a variety of contexts. We could say the same thing about marketing. All data is marketing data. All data is security data. All data is education data. All data is employment data. All data is X data. That's the mantra of framelessness. So, to say a couple of things about some of the underlying contributors to the turn to preemption is going to take us to the realm of the social. And that, I'm trying to kind of bring those together, the security, surveillance, and the social. I think one of the reasons for the turn to the preemption is the demise of symbolic efficiency, the inability to build consensus around narrative accounts of explanation and description, and the neoliberal preference for market-based or technological solutions, precisely because of that inability to build the type of political consensus that's necessary to act in a policy mode. That would require the symbolic efficiency of an explanation. These are the causes for this phenomenon. We can intervene in these causes this way. This policy will allow us to do so. Therefore, we can come up with a policy response. That's a politics operating in the register of the representational, not, and I don't mean here representative democracy, although I think that's an interesting connection, but the efficiency of narrative explanations and representations within the public sphere. A sense of the breakdown of civic dispositions, and this has, you might describe as two correlates. On the one hand, the difficulty of forming civic dispositions, which I think is connected to broader logics of commercialization and customization and the automation of sociality. And on the other hand, the figure of the undisciplinable subject, right? The subject that's not amenable to the symbolic logics of surveillance, of the panopticon. You can put this camera up, but it's not going to have any impact on this subject. That's why intervention is necessary, and you can't rely on this utilitarian logics of self-disciplining. The displacement of civic policy by technocracy, the notion that the things are very hard to sort out into explanatory narrative political terms. Let's find technological solutions, and the notion coming from Silicon Valley that they can solve a lot of these problems that seem politically intractable, and the development of surveillance systems as a surrogate for trust. If the forms of social consensus and the conditions for forming those forms of consensus break down, that amounts to a deterioration of the conditions for sociality and the forms of social trust that make possible collective action. If we see those breaking down, maybe they can be compensated for by the ubiquitous mobilization of surveillance. The notion that if you just have perfect surveillance, you don't need social trust. You don't need recognition, social recognition of others. You can have instead an automated surveillance-based system. So the broader claim is that I think what unites these developments in the realm of the social and political and in the realm of surveillance is the broader fate of the social in the context of automated or preemptive, you might say, surveillance capitalism. And so here I'm thinking about, on the one hand, what are the conditions that contribute to the deterioration for the formation of a civic disposition, by which I mean the ability to recognize the claims of others, in part because one recognizes the way in which one's own interests and self-understanding and even one's own individuality are not separable from the forms of sociality within which one is embedded. The work of the apparatuses that shape our media and communicational lives is to abstract the conception of individuality from the underlying conditions of sociality upon which it relies. This seems to me to be, in part, a political issue, in part a technological issue, in part an economic issue. All of these things conspire to imagine an abstraction of the individual from the underlying conditions of sociality. In particular, automation does this. In all of the ways in which the work that the social did is offloaded onto automated systems, work to suppress the recognition of the social foundations of all of these decisions that shape our lives, and to attempt to see them as bureaucratic or technocratic solutions that can be arrived at through objective machines of one kind or another. That's a misrecognition and a suppression of sociality, I think. And so I'm not here thinking about, I don't particularly subscribe to the filter bubble notion that what breaks down political cohesion is people only seeing information that reinforces their own prejudices and preconceptions. I think it's probably more true that people see more and more information, but that information has less and less purchase on them because of the breakdown of the conditions for recognizing the claims of others and for recognizing the extent to which their own sense of individuality is reliant upon social conditions. The automation of the social does the work of misrecognition there. But it's not just the media. It's also the whole configuration of what Wendy Brown describes as statist neoliberalism, which systematically undermines and dismantles the conditions for the recognition of social bonds and the material formation of those bonds through the policy actions that it takes. I think these all connect with one another. So the somewhat bleak prognosis is something that I think we see concern generated about globally, which is the way in which, on the one hand, the dismantling of the conditions for the formation of a civic response to political issues and political problems is complemented by, on the other hand, the emergence of the prospect of a platform of almost unlimited control that Kevin Kelly invokes in quite cheerful terms, I think still in a kind of 1990s mode. He puts it this way: it sounds quite dystopian, but in the context of the article, it actually sounds cheerful. It's a kind of entrepreneurial claim. On this platform, all things and places will be machine readable, subject to the power of algorithms. Whoever dominates this grand third platform will become among the wealthiest and most powerful people and companies in history. If the whole world is a platform, whoever finds themselves in the position to operate that platform, to collect the information and to use it to intervene in the environment, finds themselves in a condition of incredible power. So on the one hand, this power, on the other hand, the degradation of the conditions for civic response. That seems to me to be a recipe for authoritarianism, which is, I think, what prompted Carol Cadwallader's quite moving TED Talk, in which she speaks directly to the tech industry leaders and says, my question to you, is this what you want? Is this how you want history to remember you, as the handmaidens to authoritarianism? And I think responding to this combination of developments is going to mean more than tinkering around the edges. It's going to mean a reconstruction of the social, economic, and political systems whereby we represent society to ourselves and enact democratic governance. That means reconstructing society from the ground up. It's going to be much. I don't think it's going to be possible to intervene in particular, economic realms or realms of social practice on a piecemeal basis. The problem with rebuilding things from the ground up is that it often means building on the ruins. And on that somewhat grim note, I'll sign off. I look forward to catching up with all of you at some point. Have a great workshop. Thank you.
So since we started a bit late, we just gathered some thoughts collectively in response to Mark's talk that we thought we could sort of just use as a springboard for the day, because it sort of sets up quite nicely some of the key issues that we can bear in mind throughout the discussions we're having. And just sort of highlight a few things and then a few questions for us to think about. And if somebody has sort of burning comments that they want to make in response to that, we can take that as well before we then go into the next panel, okay? But the sort of four interrelated dynamics or logics that Mark identifies, so the idea that governance is shifting from prevention to preemption in this sort of post-political context, which then requires a technological or market response and dispensing of social explanation is one sort of important dynamic we can think about. The other one about that this then leads to operational efficiency, not legitimacy. Others, Zuboff has talked about instrumentarianism, or others have talked about this in terms of logistics, perhaps, that this becomes the operating logic. And then also that this is then imposed through environments or changing the rules of the game, the milieu, instead of discipline or narrative. So this idea of framelessness. And then that creates a social order that bypasses the subject, or at least a rational subject, also bypasses the need to recognize claims between subjects. So this whole idea that trust is no longer needed and surveillance becomes its surrogate. And the aim is to automate social relations, or as he says, offload the social onto automated systems. So we may want to, Mark focuses on the sort of political logics or even military logics, but we may want to complement this with other types of intersecting logics today. So also thinking more about economics perhaps, or business, or social, or media, communication, other logics as well that we might want to bring into this discussion too. But some key questions to think about in terms of what this means for the conditions we are dealing with. So in light of this, and if we accept some of these dynamics, is justice then still possible? And then what sort of justice would we be talking about? is law still possible in this post-political context? And is it legitimate? What would legitimate policy look like? Is resistance or communication for resistance possible under these circumstances or these conditions? And then if so, how? And then two overall challenges for us to reflect on as well today, considering bringing together these idea of critical legal scholarship and communication studies, is how can these two fields work together to build understanding and resistance to these changes from the ground up, as Mark suggests? And if so, what are the strengths and limitations of our fields that we have to be aware of as we face this challenge? And then also, how can we be sufficiently sensitive to the many different contexts, political contexts that we are dealing with, from liberal to authoritarian, where these transformations will play out in an unequal world? So these are sort of some of the questions that we came up with in response to this. Do others have sort of burning comments they want to make at this stage?
You want us to
Yes,
no, just one. Yeah. I was kind of, well, I was especially triggered by sort of these, the reference to Foucault's work, and I think a more general question about the questions of continuity and shifts which are taking place. So at one point he refers to this idea about sort of the intervening in the open milieu, which is there in Foucault's work, and those changes, at least in Foucault's work, obviously are already taking place in the 19th century, right? And are responses to, as you already said, also economic problems, right? How to manage an economy, how to manage a population, and how to intervene in those. So. And then, of course, I think already there you see this breakdown of this shared sense of reality and the acceptance that we can't do these kind of tasks in managing populations and economies on the basis of a set of norms, right? A set of shared norms, but rather we should operate through constant modulating forms of responses, right? So in that sense, I think a lot of what he's referring to is already has a longer prehistory. So I'm not sure, I think that's something we need to keep in mind when talking about these really recent interventions in terms of preemption of crime, etc.
Could I just throw an alternative to that? Because I agree, we're talking about continuity clearly, and that's Foucault. But just for us to think about today, whether we could argue that the continuity in a non-linear way has now leading to a phase shift, a genuinely new order where there is no boundary anymore between the social and the economic. So neoliberalism as an ideology is no longer needed because no one understands the difference between the social and the economic. That will be both continuous, but it would also in a non-linear way say we reached, shifted the equilibrium to a different point, and that's another possibility.
Someone else wants to say something? Or someone almost with an answer?
Just to follow from there, and I'll develop this more when I have a chance to speak. But I think it also, and this is, it's so dire to listen to Mark, and the issues are so all-encompassing, right? It feels completely overwhelming. But just to add to the burden, I feel as though we're implicated as scholars, as members of universities, as members of professional associations. We're implicated in terms of interrogating our own research methodologies, our own scholarly practices, our own participation in institutions that, as I'll talk about, have also been datafied and rendered frameless. So just to put that out there, I think that it's important to maintain a kind of self-reflexivity as we ourselves try to diagnose and think about ways forward.
Okay. Is that your hand? No? Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I just wanted to put it out in the group. Right where Mark is talking about the environmentality portion of his presentation and the shift, if I can read it as he said here, from modifying the terms of the game, not the player's mentality. And one of the things I've been struggling to get hold of is how much subjectivation can happen as a result of the shift that Nick is talking about, where the recognition that everything is, the world is a platform and everything is theoretically datafiable. How much subjectification can come from that? And I think that that's a huge question that needs discussing.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So we'll try and do now then a smooth transition. So we're keeping to being about sort of 15 minutes or so behind schedule. We'll try and move. I think the microphones are working, even though it doesn't sound like they are. But they're not working. I think they are working.